Hello students. In the previous lecture, we discussed about the importance of refugee and forced migration in international relations, the conceptual differences among migrants, refugees, forced migrants, and asylum seekers, the 1951 Convention relating to the status of the refugees, the pattern of global refugee movements, and the reasons for the expected rise of refugees and migrants in different parts of the world in 21st century. In this lecture, we will discuss the role of the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees, the debate who bears the cost of these refugees, and the measures how to resolve the global refugee imbalance in the world. Let us start our discussion on the role of the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees in providing protection, assistance, and solutions to millions of forcibly displaced and stateless individuals worldwide. The United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees was created under the UN umbrella and plays an important role in providing protection, assistance, and solutions to millions of forcibly displaced and stateless individuals worldwide, and it's also under tremendous pressure as a result of this trend. So if you look at the way the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees is working, because of all these problems what we discussed, so these issues, these problems has actually affected the working of the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees. On the one hand, its mandate is expanding to focus on forced displacement of people within as well as between the states. And on the other hand, it is also at the forefront of repatriation efforts as well as the provision of humanitarian assistance for war affected populations. So in that way it has two mandates. On the one hand, it is dealing with the forced displacement of the people both within the country and outside the country, and also it is at the forefront of undertaking necessary measures for repatriation, because if the situation in the domestic country improves, then these people need to be repatriated. As we have seen, many Afghans, they are now shifting from Pakistan to Afghanistan because of the improvement in their country's domestic situation. So the migrants, the forced migrant, they cannot live for a long period in a particular country because of so many factors like economy, of course. So they have to repatriated, and the United Nations High Commission on Refugees, it is not only dealing with the issue of forced migration, rather it is also undertaking necessary measures for the repatriation of the refugees or the migrants to their home country. Worldwide, refugees now constitute only 50% of the UNHCR's beneficiaries. At the same time, it is also dependent on voluntary financial contributions to carry out the existing and new programs. So it doesn't have a separate budget. No, it all depends on the voluntary financial contribution, and whether you pay it or you don't pay it, it is optional to you. But in that way, the UNHCR is finding a lot of practical financial difficulties, because sometimes you pay, you don't pay, it is up to you. But the refugees are to be looked after, they have to be repatriated. So there are so many issues for related to their education, related to their welfare. So presently the organization is facing a significant challenge due to underfunding. For instance, in the year 2023, only 32% of the UNHCR's global budget has been covered compared to 58% in 2022. So if you look at the financial data, you will find that only 32% of its global budget has been covered, and it was much higher in the year 2022. So the problem is underfunding, and as I said, the budget of the UNHCR is purely based on the voluntary financial contribution of the member countries. Consequently, the underfunding of the UNHCR has forced it to cut its budget and provide life-saving support to refugees and other forcibly displaced people in a number of operations across the world. So when you don't have the money, you can't do your duty, and that is the problem why almost if you don't have the adequate budget, then unfortunately you have to cut down your support, you have to cut down your humanitarian assistance to the refugees and to the forcibly displaced people living in different parts of the world. Now let us discuss another important issue about the the question who bears the cost of the forced migrants and refugees, because there is always a politics over the issue, and many countries belonging to the global north, they think that there is a large inflows to the global north from the global south. So there is a lot of misperception on this issue. You must have seen that in the media comments, that the countries of the north always complain that there is a large influx of forced immigrants, and they are all from countries originating from global south. So you must have seen from the recent media coverage that there is always a complaint from the countries of the global north that most of the migrants, forced migrants and refugees, they are coming from the countries of global south. It represents international migration as a threat that undermines the social, economic and cultural systems of the host countries and their security. So the continuous influx of the refugees and migrants, it is considered as a kind of threat to their social, economic and cultural system and also their security. Besides the large volume of the people, this discourse also underlines the irregularity of migration status, which is explained mostly from criminal smuggling activities. So there is also a perception that they are not forced from their home country, rather there is a criminal syndicate or criminal gangs that encourage deliberate human trafficking. So so sometimes there are two perceptions in fact. One is the number of the forced migrants and the refugees, and the second is they are coming from the countries of global south because of the nexus between the criminal gangs who particularly encourage human trafficking, and they get a hefty amount and because of this activity. However, not all countries of the global north they think in that way, but this is the predominant discourse that they always complain that they are getting a lots of forced migrants and refugees from the countries of global south, and sometimes there is a role of criminal gangs who deliberately encourage human trafficking. However, if we look at the global trends report of the UNHCR in the year 2017, you will find that migrants are 3.4% of the total world population, out of which 0.3% are the refugees. And if you look at the countries of the global south, they host almost 84% of the world's refugees, and this percent is of course increasing in the recent years, and of course this percent is increasing day by day. The poorest countries in the world host 28% of all the refugees, and just 10 countries host 57% of the refugees. What is clear from these statistics is that first, the refugee issue is almost entirely confined to the countries of global south, and secondly, those countries who are not in a better financial position, they are forced to shoulder the responsibility. So if you look at the statistics, it is not correct to say that the countries of global north, they are bearing any substantial burden of the forced migrants and refugees. Rather, it is the countries of the global south, rather the neighboring countries, we must say that they are hosting almost 84% of the world refugees, and they are also not financially supported many times. So this is an important issue that we have to discuss, that we have to debate, because the general perception is something, the data speaks otherwise. So so this is in that respect an important issue, because this challenges the whole notion of cost bearing by the countries of the global north, because there is a general perception that they are the real sufferers. Actually the data speaks otherwise. They are the countries those who bear the real cost of forced migrants and refugees. Rather, it is the countries of the global south who mostly bear the burden of forced migrants and refugees. Now let us focus our attention on how to resolve the global refugee imbalance. As we discussed, there is an imbalance between the countries of the global south and the countries of the global north on the issue of hosting the refugees, and let us now focus what necessary policy measures or what kind of initiatives should be taken to resolve this imbalance. There has been much debate about the best way to resolve the global imbalance in the refugee intake and resettlement numbers between the developed countries and developing countries that we now discuss. Now, debate largely centers on three core concerns. First, the definition of refugees, protracted refugee situations, and the Western states adopting their share of the refugee burden. So, basically the debate is on three issues, particularly how to define the word persecution, and then the protracted refugee situation and the Western states adopting their share of the refugee burden. So, these are the three important issues that we have to discuss if we want to find a reasonable solution for the refugee imbalance between the countries of the global north and the south. Recent debate has largely centered on whether the emphasis on political persecution reflects the real conditions that force the majority of the people to flee their homes. So if you look at the International Convention of 1951, that basically talks about the problem of political persecution, and that results into forced migration and refugee problem. However, people are forced to flee for a variety of reasons, and that may be economic deprivation, may be natural disaster, may be state failure to offer protection against domestic and international violence, or maybe sometimes attack from organized crime gangs. So, it is not just political persecution that is the reason for forced migration, rather there can be so many non-political issues, or maybe economic reasons, maybe cultural reasons, maybe violence, maybe security reasons. So, now the question is, why should those fleeing these life-threatening conditions are not given the same kind of protection as those fearing political persecution? So, why should we make a distinction between political persecution and non-political persecution or non-political circumstances, because both are same in one important respect, that affect to their right to life and personal well-being. The debate is basically divided between those who seek complementary protection, or what you can say in addition to the protections available for refugees under the 1951 convention, and those who argue that any effort to broaden the definition would be detrimental to the refugee protection regime. So, so the debate is basically divided between those who seek additional protection under the 1951 Refugee Convention, and others who particularly think that if you make any attempt to broaden the definition of the refugees, then that would be detrimental or not beneficial to the international protection regime on refugees, or that would be detrimental for the refugee protection regime. However, opponents of this call for broadening the definition of refugees from pure political persecution to non-political conditions, that has created a kind of opposition by some other scholars who have raised two important concerns. The first, if the conditions are broadened, state may not be more generous, rather they would be forced to be less generous. So, if you broaden the definition of refugees by expanding the scope of political persecution or by including the non-political reasons, so that would create more problems for the states, because when you make someone a refugee, you are obliged to give them some kind of rights, refugee rights under the International Convention on refugees. So, the state would be reluctant to take more or more refugees because of this problem. The second argument against broadening the refugee definition is that asylum is basically a rare protection given to those facing a threat to their physical integrity or liberty due to their expulsion from the political communities, and they are considered as enemies of the state. If you look at the physical protection of a person or right to life of a person, so in that case also, they are considered as enemies of the state. So there is a need to broaden the definition of asylum, or making it much broader than the political persecution. Those facing extreme economic, medical and environmental deprivation are often not the enemies of the state. So those who are against the broadening of the refugee definition, they particularly argue that asylum is a rare protection that is given under the international convention for their physical integrity or right to life, and they are sometimes excluded from their state because they are considered as the enemies of the state. So those who are facing extreme economic, medical and environmental deprivation, they should not be considered as enemies of the state. So basically on this ground they oppose the expansion of the definition of refugees. Second, the protracted refugee situation has also attracted controversy. Do people stay in refugee camps because their livelihood may be better than compared with their countries of origin? So you are just living in another country for a temporary period, so you are not going to stay there forever, and that is the reason why there is no need to broaden the definition of asylum. Finally, as people continue to leave their places of origin to seek asylum somewhere else, reception is never the same. Therefore, states are constantly revising their earlier policies and legislation to deter the arrival of asylum seekers. So basically, this is because of the tremendous problem of refugees and forced migration. Many countries are revising their domestic legislation so that they can deal with this kind of problem. Ultimately, international refugee law provides the scope to protect populations fleeing dangerous situations, but states have the option of deciding how to implement these laws, and this is again the crux of the problem. So states have the option, they, because they are sovereign countries, so they may take some as refugees, they may give shelter to some people, and again it is not compulsory for them to do that, they can simply refuse. So, and this is again the problem, that this is a kind of problem in other countries, that when you militarily intervene in some other countries for your national interest, for your selfish interest, then you are creating a situation in other countries, and the people, they don't have the option to live in that country or their motherland, and that's why they move to different other places for safety, for economic well-being. So so it's a very complicated issue that we have to understand from the whole debate on various aspects of refugee and forced migration. So it's a very serious debate. We have to look at the different dimensions, different issues, different perspectives that we discussed under the topic forced migration and refugees. So I think if you think about this, that will help us to find better solutions or develop better perspective to deal with this serious humanitarian issue. Let us summarize the main points we have discussed. We discussed that the United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees plays a major role in providing international protection and assistance to refugees and displaced persons worldwide. It leads efforts to safeguard their rights, coordinate humanitarian responses, and seek durable solutions, including voluntary repatriation, local integration, and resettlement. Some of the major challenges faced by the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees include funding shortfalls or insufficiency in funding. The United Nations High Commissioner on Refugees relies heavily on voluntary financial contributions, which often fall short of the required needs. This limits its ability to provide essential services and support to refugees and displaced population all over the world. Next problem is the complex and protracted refugee situations in different parts of the world. Many refugee crises are protracted, lasting for years or even decades, requiring sustained humanitarian assistance and efforts to find durable solutions such as voluntary repatriation, resettlement, or local integration. The third problem is political and security challenges. Operating in conflict affected and politically sensitive environments poses risk to the UNHCR staff and limits access to affected populations. Next problem is the protection risk. Ensuring the safety and protection of refugees, particularly the vulnerable groups such as women, children, and minorities, is challenging in the context where human rights abuses, trafficking, and exploitation are rampant. Next issue is coordination and collaboration. Effective coordination with governments, international organizations, NGOs, and other stakeholders is crucial for delivering humanitarian assistance and addressing the complex needs of the refugees. However, coordination challenges and differing priorities among the stakeholders hinder effective responses by the UNHCR. Addressing these challenges require sustained international support, increased funding, diplomatic engagement, and innovative approaches to humanitarian assistance and protection. The current global discourse emphasizes that international migration often involves large flow of migrants moving from the global south or the developing countries to the global north or the developed countries. This trend is driven by various factors, including economic disparities, political instability, intrastate conflict, environmental degradation, and aspirations for better opportunities such as education, employment, and improved living standards. As a result, there is significant attention on the dynamics of migration, its impact on both origin and destination countries, and the policies and practices aimed at managing and regulating these movements globally. The fact of the matter is that countries of the global south host about 84% of the world's refugees, and this percentage is likely to increase with the current number the highest in more than 2 decades. The debate about resolving the global imbalance in refugee intake and resettlement numbers between the developed and the developing countries revolves around several key arguments and considerations, such as defining what constitutes prosecution under international law, a more equitable distribution of responsibility, suggesting that developed countries which have greater resources and capacity should take on a larger share of the refugee resettlement. This approach is seen as fairer given the historical and economic disparities between the developed and the developing countries. There are many arguments, both from the developing countries and the developed countries, about the resettlement of refugees. The first is capacity and integration. Developing countries often host a disproportionate number of refugees relative to their resources and infrastructure. Advocates for greater resettlement in developed countries argue that these countries have better capacity to provide integration support, including education, healthcare, and employment opportunities for refugees. The second is burden sharing and solidarity. The principle of burden sharing emphasizes that all countries, regardless of their economic status, should share responsibility for hosting and supporting refugees. This approach promotes global solidarity and cooperation in addressing humanitarian crises and protecting refugee rights. The third is political and public opinion. Domestic political considerations and public opinion in developed countries often influence refugee resettlement policies. Some argue that increasing resettlement numbers in developed countries may face resistance due to concerns about security, economic impacts, and social integration challenges in those countries. And the last is long term solutions. Beyond resettlement, there is a debate about investing in long term solutions that address the root causes of displacement, such as conflict prevention, peace building, sustainable development, and promoting human rights and good governance in the countries of the origin. Overall, the debate centers on balancing humanitarian imperatives with political realities, promoting fairness and solidarity in refugee protection, and finding sustainable solutions to manage and support refugee populations globally. Thank you for your attention. Thank you once again. Goodbye.